So let's give a warm round of applause for Dr. Roberts for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I would like to just start by thanking Judy Sidran. One summer afternoon last August, I was walking my dog Fenway, and suddenly I ran into Judy, and suddenly I was doing this talk. It's a little bit more arm twisting was necessary, and Simone Schweber was more than happy to do that. And I'd also like to thank Sherry for her really superb assistance in the past few months. Okay. In 1944, 18-year-old resistance, Simone Seguin became a darling of Liberation Press. A member of the resistance, Seguin helped capture 25 POWs in Schatz and killed 2 Germans in the Paris liberation. Why did she become so popular in the press? By sheer fact of her gender, female, Seguin symbolized the unprompted heroism of the August days. Her presence implied that despite their lack of training, even women had joined the fight. In fact, Seguin's presence should not have been any surprise, given that women formed a considerable presence in all French resistance networks. Nevertheless, she became in the press a proud allegory of a fighting France. At first glance, her self-presentation as a woman with a gun signals the disruptive effect of the war on gender norms. The unwritten but deeply, deeply seated rule of war, that it is fought for women, not by women, had apparently been broken. Seguin's presence signaled the failure of French men to protect their homes and their women. In that sense, Seguin was a source of humiliation as well as pride. Seguin, in other words, had become a man in the shameful presence of French men. Sorry, in the shameful absence of French men. Or had she? A second glance at Seguin's embodiment as a male warrior complicates such a conclusion. In fact, her appearance defies easy gender assignment. The shorts were short and accentuated her tan, lean legs. Her blouses were fashionable, her hat was dashing, and her waist decorated with either a coquettish bow or a gallant red sash. The most subversive element of her image lay not in the fact that Seguin sported a machine gun, but that she did so with unmistakable panache. Seguin used her clothes to present as female, even as the machine gun signaled a disruption in gender norms. Like other women resistors, she was left to invent her own visual appearance. As Elisabeth Terroir has put it, women resistors were combatants without uniforms, combattants sans uniforme. Even in the summer of 1944, when women could have received uniforms, American uniforms or Allied uniforms from the United States Army, their male partisans forbade them for doing so. Unable to wear uniforms then, women resistors had to sort of be left to their own devices in asserting their credibility as fighters. Seguin's choice is illuminating. She, first of all, she represents an impudence which would not have been possible before the liberation, because in wearing what the French called tricolore, right, red, blue, and white, she clearly articulated her own Republican sympathies. This would not have been possible during the war. So the very fact that she wore these 3 colors again is a kind of liberatory joy of the moment. But the other thing that's interesting about her uniform, or how she comes up with it, is its clear parallel to the dress of the French revolutionaries in 1789. And I'm showing you, these are called sans culottes. They were the French revolutionaries. She's clearly modeled herself after that. In this way, she did something very clever. which was to align herself with the French tradition of revolutionary fighting, and also to borrow the legitimacy of the French Revolution for her own military credibility and legitimacy. So, very clever move on her part to adopt the French Revolution with its deep-seated tradition and also its military legitimacy. So this is how one woman solves the problem of no uniform. Now, today what I want to do is follow her lead and explore what women wore to the resistance during the war. Now, historians often dismiss dress, and I know this is heretical to say in this building, but historians often dismiss clothing and dress as too frivolous an object to merit historical analysis. But contrary to that view is when I began to read these memoirs of resistance, I was struck again and again by their extremely detailed understanding and memory of what they wore at the time of their deployment, at the time of their going to the woods, at the time of their laying bombs, and so on and so forth. And I'm just going to give you a few examples. Eveline Soudareau recalls that when she joined the Maquis, and the Maquis were resistance fighters who literally lived in the woods, she took a skirt made from a bedspread, a blouse, sandals, and one pair of hand-knitted underwear. That was all she wore for 2 months. When Nancy Wake, at the very top of the Gestapo's most wanted list, parachuted into France as a spy, she remembered, and I quote, she remembered that over civilian clothes, silk stockinged and high-heeled, I wore overalls, carried revolvers in my pockets, and topped the lot with a bulky camel-haired coat, webbing harness, parachute, and a hat. And if you can imagine a woman parachuting in silk stockings and high heels, then you know where this talk is going. Yeah. So, and my guess is too, is that if Hedy Strawn had actually been able to write her memoir, she would have remembered the clothes she wore at the moment of arrest, at the moment of her deportation. That would have been part of her memory. Okay. So I decided this is something to explore. How could it be frivolous if they remember it in such detail? And remember also, and this is where Hedy's a little different, these are French women. So while femininity everywhere was structured through beauty and fashion, that is particularly true in France. Okay? So in as much as I was looking at French women, I felt I had license to truly explore this and try to understand it, okay? Inasmuch as clothing served as a kind of self-presentation of a woman's body, it signaled changes in how these women saw themselves as a presence in the world. In other words, it transcribed their transformation as they began to fight in the woods and become resistors in other ways. And so that's what this talk is about. So let's begin by exploring clothing before the war. Now, again, it's a truism that fashion plays a unique role in French cultural life. What one wore in Paris dictated, to a great extent, what one wore throughout Europe and the world. And again, this is very much what Hedy was doing. No doubt, if she couldn't go to the Paris shows, she would definitely have read about the shows, seen the visual images in magazines which were circulating in Czechoslovakia. Okay? What Hedy did was she designed for what was called the modern woman. The first generation of women after the Great War in the 20s and 30s who were actually working outside the home in large numbers. And as she envisioned the modern woman, she was very feminine, but she was also confident, and she wore clothing that is very tailored. Okay, so there was a way in which she could assert her credibility in her clothing. So smart suits for work, and then also evening clothes for night out. And again, that same blend of masculinity and femininity I was talking about with Simone Seguin. Now, with the start of the war, the meaning of clothing changed dramatically. First, dress, like body weight, became a measure of collaboration. If you were fat in wartime Paris, it meant you were collaborating. Okay? Women who continued to wear fashionable clothing raised suspicion among the population because either they were buying it, they were rich enough to buy nice clothing on the black market, or they had connections with the German authorities and were getting goodies from them. If you wore more austere dress, that signaled a kind of righteous deprivation which earns you respectability in wartime France. So in this way, fashion becomes suffused with the politics of collaboration and resistance. Okay? Also politicized, and what you're looking at here, were the clothes worn by the German occupiers. The French nicknamed the Germans by the color of their uniforms. Who but the French would name an occupying force by the color of their uniforms? Okay, but that's what they did. They were called the vert de gris, which is the gray-green. The women had it even worse. They were dismissed as frumpy, souris grises, or gray mice. Okay, gray mice. And the fact, again, that the French focused on the German uniform, it seems to me, to express hostility towards their occupiers, seems to me further evidence of the centrality of fashion to French identity. Now, there were a lot of restrictions placed on them. You can see the rationing coupons in the middle, but it hardly dampened the desire for stylish dress. And this fashion magazine, Marie Claire, became even greater in circulation during the war as French women struggled to keep up appearances and learned how to navigate between righteous frumpiness and stylish self-indulgence, right? They had to be stylish, but not so stylish they looked like collaborators. And the links between the French female body and fashion were bound together by a concept called coquetry. And I'm going to talk a lot about coquetry today. It's a distinctly French trait which combines flirtation and beauty and seduction. Okay, to be a coquette was to be a flirtatious, stylish woman, and who was elegant for the purposes of seduction. So in some ways, a coquette upheld both female identity for the French, but also French identity for the French. Okay? And French women's refusal to succumb to sartorial adversity has been seen as a way of asserting their Frenchness in a state of defeat, in a state of occupation. In other words, coquetry became not just a form of seduction, but a matter of French pride, okay, in a humiliating period. Now, we can see this at work in the Auxiliary Territory Service, which was a British organization, the women's branch of the British Army, kind of like the waves and the WACs and all that in this country. And about 70 French women actually flew into Britain and joined the ATS. So there was a little French contingent within the ATS. They called it at first the Corps Féminin des Volontaires Françaises. And unfortunately, the words Corps Féminin was called the female body. And this created so many jokes on the part of the army men that they realized they had to change the name, okay, because they couldn't call them a feminine body, Corps Féminin. So they called them the Corps of Volunteers, the Corps of French Volunteers. And so what that suggests to me is this issue about credibility again, that there was such a male obsession with the female sexual body that women had to really struggle to become credible as military personnel. The uniform, which the ATS did wear, was great for these women because it coded not only military authority, but masculine authority. It was at both masculine, but also asexual, okay? Which is not to say the uniform is not sexy, right? We all love a woman in a uniform, right? But it was coded as asexual. And for women who are from France, French women did not vote at this time. This is 1941, so it established not only military credibility, but a civic identity for women. Now, again, one attempt to make was when French women actually got to wear the ATS uniform, and for some women it was a consummate honor. And one of them was this remarkable woman, Raymond Tessier-Joret, who was actually a native of New Caledonia, a French colony, and sailed to England to join the ATS. And she vividly remembers the first time she put on the ATS uniform. For those of you who have seen Foyle's War, okay, the driver is in the ATS. That might help you, okay? The driver of Foyle, you know, I can't remember her name, but she has the ATS uniform on. So the first time that Raymond puts it on, this is what she says. Well, the khaki color was not flattering on me, but I was so very proud. Proud as well of the little tricolore ribbon surrounding the left epaulette of the jacket, which distinguished me as a French woman. Proud as well to write my family that evening and say, at last, I am finally a soldier. Tessier-Joret's deep investment in the uniform stems from its power to confer status as a soldier and a citizen. But unfortunately, not every French woman of the ATS was so gratified. When other French members received their uniform, they denounced the hat, in particular, as horrible, horrible, insupportable, and a hideous thing that only the British could invent. So loudly did the women complain that they were issued instead a smart navy calot, which is over here, with the French women. So you have the two British women here and the French woman over here. According to Jean Boeck, the calot had a charm which was more French. As in the case of the German grey mice, these women again are asserting their Frenchness through their dislike of the British frumpy uniform, right? The dowdy British, the fashionable French. It's that old. The French women also refused to wear the gas mask, which was, they complained that it made them look like British Martians, and they threw it aside, keeping only the case, which you see in front of their chest there, which they used as a chic purse for their makeup. They also personalized their uniform by wearing their own glosses, by wearing silk stockings instead of the wool or cotton ones they were issued, and they also put pads on the shoulders of the uniforms to make their waist look smaller. And their French superiors were supposed to forbid such changes, but instead looked the other way, exploring. They explained themselves that feminine coquetry was innate for their French compatriots. So there's that word again, right? Feminine coquetry is innate. Okay, this is Marie-Madeleine Fourcade. I'll speak of her in a minute. Although a military uniform conferred status and authority, it was an impossible option for the vast majority of female resistors. To carry on their clandestine political activities, she wore civilian clothing, but strived to make it as elegant as possible. That stylishness they had to justify, right, given the link we've already established between stylishness and collaboration. For a liaison agent, one resistant argued, elegant clothing was equivalent to work dress. Another, even in this period of scarcity, we had to force ourselves to dress elegantly or at least be correct in our behavior. Here's Madeleine Fourcade. And Madeleine Fourcade, by the way, ran the largest resistance network in France during the war. She was wanted, I think she was 1 or 2 on the Gestapo list. And when the Allies, she managed to smuggle out to the Allies a 60-foot map of the Normandy coast. Okay, so this is a woman who's very powerful and fearless. She said, "I kept a coquette's interest in my appearance, a fact which served me often. Without my looks and my age," she believed, "my life would have been lost." So for female resistors, body type, clothing, hair, and makeup provided an innocuous presentation of femininity, which rendered subversive activities possible. About to be arrested, Suzanne Va asked the Gestapo if she could curl her hair while they were searching her apartment. With an overly hot curling iron, she scorched all the subversive documents that she had in the bathroom. And by the time the Gestapo had finished searching, she had managed to destroy all secret documents about coastal intelligences. So as these women began to figure out what they could get away with, they began to, in fact, broker their physical appearance, their bodily display. René Miron-Leval managed to get a Nazi prison key out of the building by hiding it in the crease of her flowered hat. One day, another partisan and her mother were transporting, obviously contraband, Allied parachutes on their bicycles from the train station. When they reached the station stairs, they saw two Germans at the top watching them. It was Mama who saved the situation, remember the partisan, pretending not to be able to carry everything up the stairs at the same time that she threw a pleading smile at the two policemen. The result, the two Germans helped mother and daughter carry enemy parachutes up the stairs. They were not the only two Nazis to carry contraband for a woman. The Jewish resistor, Bascom, carried family valuables around Paris in a suitcase to avoid their confiscation. Once when she was passing just in front of Notre Dame, she was approached by two German soldiers. She froze until one of them said, "Madame, the suitcase is way too heavy for a beautiful woman like you." Now, given the stakes of a partisan's appearances and how it's changing, clothing itself changes radically in meaning. In short, clothing becomes a weapon of war. Clothing becomes a weapon of war. Many women sewed a tournure, or a pocket, under their skirts to conceal papers. They got the idea from their grandmothers. Foucault praised the merits of silk as particularly effective for secreting documents. When Cécile Ouzoulias-Romagon was stopped by the police, her clothing was bursting with incriminating evidence. In the right pocket of my suit was a letter I was to hand over to Hélène for Professor Marcel Prenon. Even worse, in a silky pouch between my girdle and my skin, that would be the tournure, was an entire set of papers which I was to give to Mireille to pass on to the regional authorities. Because she was pregnant, the police did not find her large belly suspicious. In fact, she had all the documents rolled over her stomach, okay? Nor did they notice any difference in her size when she managed to get to the bathroom to destroy the documents by flushing them down the toilet, okay? Lise Lesève hid her most important papers in what she called a feminine jumble in her purse, including recipes and knitting patterns. When she was arrested, this is actually my favorite because I'm a knitter. When she was arrested, the Nazis managed to miss the incriminating papers, instead preoccupying themselves with the knitting instructions for a sock heel. Okay. Unable to understand them, the Gestapo concluded they were subversive papers written in secret code. So you can imagine the Gestapo like K1, P1, P1, YO, okay? K2, TOG, you know, fantastic story. Okay, as a result of training, we're going to talk about transformation now. I told you that this clothing is an important part of women's transformation during the war. They learn new skills, right? They learn how to shoot a gun, they learn how to sabotage a rail line. And by virtue of these new competencies, as well as the dangers they undertook in the company they kept, they underwent sometimes dramatic personal transformation. For the most part, historians have understood this in a kind of, I think, flat way. That as they began to do masculine things, they became more manly. They became more masculine, okay? But as we've already seen in the case of Seguin, the transformation was so much more complex than that, as a move from male to female, from female to male. So what I want to do is to sort of briefly delve into the life and the resistance work of one amazing, absolutely amazing resistant from Brittany named Marie Chamy. And I want to argue that far from these women making a simple leap from a female to a male, that the transformation was extremely complicated, and what they wore was key to this very complex transformation. Okay? So here's Shamming's story. She was 20 years old. She's from Brittany. When she joined the resistance, she first worked in Paris intelligence, producing false papers, and then she went back to her home of Brittany and served in the resistance there. She joined the Maquis, those resistance in the woods, and again, she remembered exactly what she was wearing when she went to join them in the summer of 1944. She had a change of underwear, a homemade shirt, a skirt in blue cotton, and a khaki raincoat. Those are what she wore for about 9 months in the woods. Without military dress, though, and this is a point where all the Maquis and other male resistance members are getting these uniforms from the United States Army, but the funny little dirty secret, by the way, is that most of them were too big, because Americans are so much bigger than the French, okay? So even the men had to send almost all of the uniforms home. But most of them, got the extra smalls, and they had them on. She, however, was not allowed to wear one. And so she describes herself in the resistance camp as not in my place and infinitely alone. So she thinks of herself not as something, not as a man, but not as a man, in the negative terms of indeterminacy, as unfeminine, as not in her place, unable to conform to femininity in her present circumstances, and equally unable to imagine herself as manly. She feels only excruciating isolation. As she remembers, this is my favorite, I put myself out to sea, alone in the storm. Yes, we were all alone, dispersed by the wind of war. Now, Shamming's story plays out between two unreachable storms. Two unreachable shores. The one she has left behind and the one she cannot gain. Her fantasy life revolves around past life expectations. She says, and this is in her memoir, my youth was passing, irreplaceable, and sometimes a crazy desire seized me to forget everything and leave, to go to surprise parties and big nights out, to love a man and to get married. Nostalgia surfaces particularly in the longing for feminine clothing. She remembers feeling ashamed of her jacket, which made it impossible for her to, quote, be elegant, faire des élégances. When a comrade gives her a blue and red silk piece from a parachute, she stuffs what she calls these ravishing scarves under her clothing for after the war. Once invited to a formal dinner, she laments her lack of a dressy dress and resigns herself to a change of underwear. To view Shamming's struggle as a transition from female to male not only misses the complexity of the moment, but also misses the point, since neither gender pole is a viable option for her at that time. Set adrift, forced to navigate indeterminate waters, she moves forward by embracing multiple selves at the same time. August 1944 finds her on a dangerous spy mission in Brittany, at the same time that she falls in love with a fellow resistant named George and agrees to marry him. Wedding plans bring on more nostalgia. I had always dreamed of the day where I could put on a dress which was unique and more beautiful than all the others. I saw myself as a princess with a pinched-in waist and yards of fabric around the bottom. George would look at me like a queen. Instead, she resigns herself to buying a simple dress for the occasion. The events of late August elevate Shamming's storm to hurricane force. First, her fantasy wedding dress materializes. A lieutenant provides a white silk parachute and suggests she makes a gown. So you'll see she's draping the silk on the left. When she drapes the silk around her, her fiancé explains, "Oh, What an incredible dress that would make for you. Why not, she thinks. Pourquoi pas? And hires a seamstress to make the dress. But then tragedy strikes. Her beloved father, also in the resistance, is shot dead by the Germans. Overcome with grief, Chaming decides she must marry George right away. Given the dangers facing the couple, she reasons, she wants to bear his child as soon as possible. His race must continue, the race of men who have risked everything and which must not disappear. The race of my father. Chamming's reasons for marriage here signal a radical departure from what had been a conventional dream life. She now fantasizes about herself as a valiant mother of a warrior race. By just placing her grief onto motherhood, she resituates it within a framework of political risk and self-sacrifice. While Chamming was able in some ways to meet the demands of both resistance and woman in August, her father's death disrupts that balance. The first convulsions surface in the matter of the wedding gown, which she resolves not to wear. When she gives this news to the seamstress, she decides she's insisting. The seamstress insists she at least try the dress on. So that's the dress in the right picture. I turned around again and again in front of the mirror, she remembered. No dress had ever flattered me so much, making me look thinner and taller. Her dressmaker promises to fasten the neck with a croix de Lorraine, which was the emblem of the resistance. It's a crucifix with two horizontal bars. It's a shrewd offer, actually, as it would transform the bridal gown into a sort of military uniform, purifying it of personal self-indulgence. But Chamming cannot be convinced to embody a bride, even a politicized one. Her ambivalence, her sense of not being in her place, again, is profound. While Georges wears his uniform to the ceremony, she dons the same clothes she has worn in the woods, including the white blouse she remembered did not flatter me. Refused a military uniform then, Chamming disavows yet another, the white gown every woman wears to the altar. The rich texture of Chamming's transformation lies in its many entangled threads, normative fantasies and longings, new embodiments of a warrior, faith in the passionate creed of self-sacrifice and austerity, revisioning mother, refusal of marital customs. Fantasy, trauma, and displacement shape her narrative more than any conscious process. In other words, it's way more complicated than a woman turning into a man. More than a symbol of disavowed femininity, the unworn wedding dress is a site of mourning for her father and the ever-receding shores of childhood. Okay, I want to turn now to Ravensbrück. Now, this will be the end. This is what I'll finish with. I think you'll see that there are many parallels between Ravensbrück and Hedy's camps that she went to, not only Theresienstadt, but also the other ones as well. Ravensbrück was actually built as a political prisoner camp for women only. About 8,000 French women went there. So if you were arrested by the Gestapo, and many women were, this is where you went. So this, I thought, would be an extension of the French resistance stories, but also a tribute to Hedy. Ravensbrück was not explicitly a death camp. It was a work camp, but there was a lot of systematic killing that went there, particularly towards the end. Prison dress counted among the strategies used by the Nazis to deny inmates their individuality. So upon arrival, the partisans were stripped naked of all their clothes and issued a cotton-striped dress and jacket, a white headscarf, socks, and clogs. The outfit, I think, amounted to a cruel joke. At last, the women resistors were getting their uniforms. Even in the highly regulated environment of Ravensbrück, however, the Nazis could neither master nor manage the complex range of meanings attached to female dress. Dress provided not only a resource for individual expression, itself anti-Nazi, but also an opportunity for resistance against German oppression, as we'll see. So while the Nazi camp has often been seen as a site of human abjection, right, complete and absolute loss of agency, if we look at clothing, we'll see that's also a myth, that there's much more resistance going on in tiny ways, in micro ways. Okay? Okay. Clothing marked the moment of entry into the camp. It became a visible marker of the transition from person to inmate. So here you have the women, and this is by amazing set of designs, of sketches by Violette Fougier-de-Cook. And she has the French women arriving here, and here they are, 2 heures après, 2 hours after. So the rapidity of the transition. As a result, memoirs of Ravensbrück by French resistors consistently talk about this moment. It's literally in almost all the memoirs. They not only are stripped, but they undergo a humiliating inspection in which all their orifices are searched, and they are then showered and issued new clothing. So the process initiates them into the degradation and the brutality of the camp. And here is how one French resistant responded. I no longer wear clothes. I no longer have shoes. I no longer have purse, briefcase, pen. I no longer have a name. There is no doubt that clothing marked the degradation of life and of humanity in the camp, particularly in terms of its cleanliness. The one pair of underwear issued to each inmate was cleaned once a month. In the summer, women could clean their own pair, and they would literally hold it out themselves to the breeze to dry. But in the winter, it was too cold and windy to accomplish that. The uniform was filthy, and it harbored lice in its seams. In the absence of toilet paper and Kotex, strips of clothing were used for hygienic purposes. Prisoners were given nothing for their monthly bleeding and were severely punished if they stained their clothes. Fortunately, women rapidly stopped menstruating once they arrived at the camp. Prisoners were also forced to paint large crosses on their shirt back, sew it on their number, and their red triangle for political prisoner. So in this way, clothing produced an inmate's non-identity, identity as a number. Your identity at Ravensbrück, noted Bluet Morat, was no longer your name upon arrest, whether true or false, but a number imprinted on white calico and ridiculously stuck on your sleeve. Women, like clothing, were reduced to Stücke, effet, things. But clothing in the form of heat and protection symbolized life. Very warm, lined with silk, was how Lisa Lesèvre described the coat she was given in December 1944. Clothing also served as a weapon against dehumanization, in particular when it engaged the power of coquetry. The French women at the camp earned a reputation for making chic bows and headpieces out of their rags. And that word chic was actually used by a Russian woman to describe the French. Lesèvre was once reproved for wearing a lavender blue band to contain her hair. Explained the guard who scolded her, "You are too elegant." But these precious remains of an old life became freakish in the territoid life of the camp, soliciting a sarcasm which echoed despair. The so-called fashion column in the camp newspaper collapsed into farce. One column wrote, "Stripes are very much in fashion this year," as is jewelry and iron wires and filings. The face of Ravensbrück coquetry found its most graphic expression in the sketches of Jean Lemonnier, who arrived in January 1944. At the risk of her life, Lemonnier obtained pencil and paper and began to sketch her fellow inmates in the French bloc. The latter had requested pictures of themselves in des poses parisiennes, Parisian poses. The result was a macabre version of the 1940s pinup, or designer image. Le Menier stylized the prison uniform by belting the waist and giving it a fashionable length. She mimicked figures in French fashion magazines down to the smallest details, wavy hairstyle, tiny waist, and coquettish pose. And if I then turn you to this, you'll see just how like Hedy's poses they were. The pose of this, the confident modern woman, okay, now in Robinson. Now, in sharp contrast, I'm sure you noticed, was the blank face. And this was a hallmark of all Le Menier's sketches, every single one of them. No doubt, the featureless face served to critique the camp's harsh anonymity. But it is doubly posing when you consider that the sketches were done at the request of particular individuals. Whatever the motive, Le Menier's sketches have the effect of mocking the very logic of coquetry in a concentration camp. Inasmuch as fashion operated to enhance individuality, particularly with the case of the modern woman, it was doomed in a place which reduced people to stuck-up, effet, numbers, things. If the inmate sought to better their looks at Ravensbrück, it was in fact only to avoid selection. Many of the older Polish prisoners, for example, somehow found dye in order to dye their hair from gray in order to look younger and healthier and then survive the selections. Clothing also shaped Ravensbrück and life at it inasmuch as it became the basis for inmate day labor. At the highest level, and this is what Hedy would have done if she arrived, French dressmakers were made to sew dresses and evening gowns for the wives of the Gestapo. On a larger scale, many inmates were forced to sew German uniforms. The factory conditions were abominable. The women labored up to 11 hours a day in workshops thick with dust and deafening in noise. However, the sewing workshop again provided the women with the opportunity to commit acts of sabotage, including wasting very good thread and large pieces of fabric. The Russian inmates were actually members of the Red Army. They were not political prisoners. They intentionally sewed up openings in the arm or cut away the elastic so that when somebody put it on pants, a man would put on pants, they would instantly fall down. They also sewed buttons in such a way that they wouldn't fasten properly, and my favorite, they inserted notes in the seams which cursed the Germans and told them that they would lose the war. The meaning of camp dress changed abruptly in January 1942 after the Nazi decision made at the Wannsee conference that month to exterminate the Jews. Beginning in February, the SS organized Sondertransports, other transports, to remove prisoners from Ravensbrück. Their purpose was to murder the inmates in an undisclosed location nearby. Among the women targeted were the Jewish prisoners. Before leaving, the women to be exterminated were ordered to take off their Ravensbrück uniform and to put on civilian clothing. The idea was to save the uniforms for the living, not the dead. When the Sondertransport lorries arrived empty to the camp the day after the women left, there were still those civilian clothes in the truck, in the lorry, so that in this way the women's clothing actually announced the women's death to the inmates in the camp when they saw the lorry. However, once again, this provided for women an opportunity. Once the prisoners, the surviving prisoners, realized that their clothes, if they died, would be sent back to the camp, they decided to write notes in the pockets and other secret places about where they were going, what had happened, and so on and so forth. So that those inmates still living back at the camp knew to find these notes once the lorries came back. One of them read, so this was written by a woman to be exterminated, put in the pocket of a dress, which was then discovered by the women back in the camp who went through the clothing and kept it. Arrived in Dessau, told, and this is, by the way, where they were killed, which is a small city just outside of Berlin. Arrived in Dessau, told we're now to bathe and will be given new clothes and assigned jobs. Besides gleaning information from these notes, the inmates considered them crucial because at present they were the only concrete evidence that the murders had taken place of their friends and fellow inmates. In the vast silence, sealing off German atrocities, the seams, hidden pockets, and hems of prison clothing opened feeble lines of communication. Particularly as the SS began to burn rather than bury bodies, clothing increasingly bore testimony to mass murder. When Geneviève de Gaulle was in solitary confinement in Ravensbrück and believed her death to be imminent, she agonized, "Will they know something of my end? A dress riddled with bullet holes, stained with blood. That is how we have learned of the fate of others, and that is how they will learn of my death." In cases where women also died from torturous medical experiments, mostly Polish women, which were common in Ravensbrück, there was a note sent to the parents saying that the prisoners had died of heart failure, okay? There were effects actually given back to the families. Again, the inmates took this as an opportunity to tell the truth, to get the word out to the world. So they took notes and told about the experiments and told how the women had actually died, and they sewed them into the effects, the seams that would be sent to the parents. Again, not only telling the parents how the woman had actually died, but also giving them concrete evidence that these murders were taking place. And by the end of the war, by the way, the Nazis started ripping out linings, ripping out interfacing, because they were onto this, finally, that these clothing had served as secret, feeble messages to the world. In early summer 1943, the clothing of the dead replaced the Nazi uniform, the Nazi camp uniform. It became common for women to wear clothes too big or too small for one's body, as well as mismatched shoes. The effect was to deprive clothes of their rational relationship to the human body, right? That you buy clothes that have a rational relationship to your size, your height, your girth, and so on and so forth. For the women, it was deeply humiliating. So literally to wear mismatched shoes, clothes that were too big, clothes that were too small. The clothing of those exterminated at Auschwitz began to arrive in Ravensbrück by the truckful. As the camp got more and more populated, there were no more uniforms, so they used the clothing of dead people to clothe the inmates at Ravensbrück. As one French Jew, Marceline Loridon-Yvon, said, "Death regurgitated so many clothes. There were too many clothes." And the result of this shipments in Ravensbrück, hidden shed, which stored thousands of objects, including jewelry, clothes, and shoes from all over Europe. The French prisoners called it Galeries Lafayette, after Paris's most elegant department store. The nickname, again, I think, declares coquetry to be a farce at Ravensbrück. But the clothing of the dead also gave hope to the living. Working at Galeries Lafayette, which were many French women who worked there, meant shoplifting coats, quote unquote shoplifting, right? Shoplifting coats, shoplifting socks, shoplifting shawls, warm clothing, and then giving them to your comrades back in the camp, or selling them or trading them for food. It meant literally survival for these women and others. On Christmas Day, 1944, the last Christmas of the war, Geneviève de Gaulle is still in solitary confinement, and she receives a package from the other French women, which they smuggled in when the SA were drunk and sleeping. And it has many treasures in it, beautiful things. But the best for her was a neatly folded beige shawl in light wool, which I immediately wrap around myself so as to be surrounded by their gentle, warm tenderness. Even after being liberated in the first chilly days of spring 1945, de Gaulle wore the shawl for warmth and comfort. She was wearing it when she entered Paris once again. As the niece of Charles de Gaulle, she gained special prisoner status, which meant she was given back her canvas sandals and wool dress, the navy wool dress with short sleeves. With great pleasure, she remembered, she slipped on the wool stockings and the coat friends had given her when she was in a Paris prison. The garments became a sustaining force as they reminded her of family, friends, and comrades. Even after the liberation, female resistors did not cease to render inventories of their clothes. And this one is particularly striking. It comes in a memoir by Manon Cormier of her days in Ravensbrück. When she got back to Paris, she literally took a picture of what she had worn while in the camp. Notable here is the way Cormier's clothing, and particularly her stockings, retain the shape of her body, as if to hold its memory. Cormier's body and her clothes have emerged in unbearable suffering and cannot now be separated. The same was true of memory. It was hard to lose. Survivor Loridon Yvon also invested clothing with the memory of anguish. Shortly after she returned from Auschwitz, she remembers going to her brother's wedding. Everyone present had been in the camps and survived, but no one spoke of it. The bride wore the traditional white gown. She said, the dressy clothes were nothing more than armor thrown over the clothes from the camps. She recalls, on my back, I carried the mountains of clothes that we'd sorted through and the stench of burnt flesh that would stay with me forever. After liberation, it was suffering that needed to remain under clothing, kept safe from being revealed. Loridon Yvon cannot lose the memory of the war's agony. Unlike normal clothing, her anguish can be neither taken off nor covered over, most especially by a wedding gown. Thank you.